Welcome to BIB Today, the daily business podcast from the Newsroom of Business in Vancouver. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief. This is the time of year when typically our thoughts turn to the needs of others. This is when we tend to look at giving, at volunteering, at offering a piece of our privileges to those without. But of course, 2020 is not typical. It's imposed a financial hardship on many people, or imposed a kind of emotional strain to take our attention away from the larger picture of necessary care for each other. New research from Imagine Canada suggests that only half of us in British Columbia will be donating money over the holiday season. Only 7% of us plan on volunteering. Those numbers are dramatic declines. My guest today, I hope, will provide some insights into this and perhaps even encourage a little bit of a rejuvenation of our generosity and our giving sense. Bruce McDonald is the president and the CEO of Imagine Canada, and Kevin McCourt is the president and CEO of the Vancouver Foundation. Good to have you with us.
Glad to be here.
Kevin, I remember talking to you shortly after we were clouded by the pandemic, and it appeared as if people had initially stepped up with support. So what's happened along the way?
Yeah, back in March and April, when it was clear that a lot of social service charities were seeing a significant increase in demand for services and a simultaneous drop off of income, and saw the same in the arts and culture sector where income had really dropped, we did have a really strong response from people. The Vancouver Foundation itself, United Way, Van City, a number of private foundations, companies across the province contributed several $1 million to our response fund. And that money was really well timed. It was into the charitable sector before many of the federal programs launched. So we were able to, thanks to a very strong response in March and April, support the sector through the summer. And as the federal supports came in, the wage subsidy and the rent relief programs, some of the pressure came off of the charities, but they're starting to see now, trying in December to make up for lost ground. There's some good support coming from people for charities in December, but there was a long period and they're trying to make up for a very significant decline over the course of the year.
Yeah, Bruce, one of the most surprising parts of your research seemed to be that only 7% are going to be volunteering. 7%. Normally it's 4 times that. How much of that has to do with the fact that people can't as easily volunteer in person right now?
Well, I think that's the primary contributor. And so if people are just staying home in general, if the kinds of service experience that they would have normally been participating in aren't taking place, and even with organizations who now have to have PPE for their volunteers, it's an entirely different experience. And don't forget, many of our volunteers in this country are older adults who are most susceptible, most vulnerable to the virus itself. So it's had quite a significant effect on people's ability to engage. Though we have seen some organizations who are, converting their volunteer experiences online.
Yeah, I don't want to go back too much and revisit the We Charity issue out there, but one of the virtues inside that program was the idea that younger people were going to move much more into the volunteer sector of our society and all that. What has happened in the course of the year in terms of trying to bring younger people in so that when we come to times like this, we don't have an older cohort carrying it all?
Well, it's interesting. I think that our society in general is trying to figure out new pathways to engage donors, new pathways to engage citizens as participants in causes, whether they're registered charities, whether they're social enterprises or nonprofit organizations. It's trying to find new ways to engage, because the old ways, for the most part, have been put in kind of a state of suspended animation, if you will. Now, I think the good news is that our sector is pretty adaptable. And some of our data shows that almost 80% of organizations have been innovating, experimenting, finding new ways to deliver their service, engage with donors. And young people are part of that equation, because I often say that I think that these coming generations have social good in their DNA, and they're very creative about ways they can find to engage.
Yeah. Kevin, the last quarter of the year, though, often sees these much higher profile events to raise funds? How much of an impact on the environment for donation has been hurt by not just the disappearance of those events, but a little bit of the aftermath of them, where people really turn their thoughts to these particular charities?
Yeah, well, one of the trends that has been evident in the charitable sector for some time is this more from fewer, that we see that the major gift donors are carrying a increasing proportion of the gifts to the charitable sector. And in fact, that trend is continuing. And there's a lot of talk about the K-shaped recovery, that those who went into the recession with resources are coming out, in some cases, with more, and those who went in and vulnerable are coming out with less. We are seeing people step up. You know, the great example in Vancouver was the CBC Food Bank Day that raised over $2 million,
Yeah, that
double
was
what they
incredible.
raised the year before.
Yeah.
We're seeing at Vancouver Foundation possibly 10% in increase in gifts over last year, and a lot of it is coming in the final quarter, because there are people who are recognize that they've been very fortunate, recognize that many of their citizens have not been as lucky, and they're responding. But it won't
So,
make up for all the gap that we lost over the course of the year.
so Kevin, of those giving, are they giving more?
It seems so. Well, it's interesting. The data is showing that most people are saying they're going to give less. But those, so at the aggregate level across the population, the surveys show that people are planning to give less. But we are seeing in some instances that their giving in December is up, but their giving over the course of the year may be down, because people are recognizing it's my last chance in the calendar year to make a gift. I really should get swing into action and make a gift in December.
Yeah, Bruce, I want to go back to what you said a little earlier with an answer, which is about the adaptability of a lot of charities. What kinds of things are charities doing right now in this period to adapt?
Well, I mean, they're doing everything from trying to take what were formerly in-person special events and create a digital experience. So, for example, if they were having a gala dinner where they used to bring, 200 to 500 people or more together, what they're trying to do now is say, well, why don't you have an in-home gala? Have a nice dinner that you and your partner will take part in, and you'll watch online testimonials and impact videos that are streamed in from the organization, and inviting those who were ticket buyers to be contributors. In other cases, they're being really creative. I've been talking to some organizations where even a community foundation, and Kevin's obviously part of that movement, has created a funding program whereby charities receive money. But the condition is that those charities use the money to purchase services from small business. And what they've done is recognize that small business for generations have been wonderful supporters of charities and nonprofits, and are in real jeopardy themselves. And they found this creative way of bringing the two together to ensure that the services are provided by the charity, but instead of getting free services from small business, they're actually paying for them, and the foundation has done it. So there's these wonderful examples of creativity that are emerging.
Yeah, and Kevin, pick up on that. What kind of innovations taking place right in our own backyard here?
Well, I would go back to your point about volunteering and people finding ways to engage online. So Vancouver Foundation runs an event called On the Table, where we have asked people in the province to get together and talk about what matters in their community. And Girl Guides of BC came to us and said, we'd love to create a badge for Girl Guides. They can earn the badge if they have a conversation in their community about what matters. And so people so this is the creativity. They're taking something and using it in ways we never possibly imagined. And 3,000 Girl Guides earned a badge for having a conversation in their community about what matters to them. And it's a wonderfully creative way to involve another generation of people in community. And so what we're seeing a lot of interest around are conversations about building social cohesion, because a lot of people are convinced that the best way we're going to get out of this pandemic is having a society where people know and trust each other. We've been socially and physically distancing for so long that people are really looking for ways to connect, and being very creative in how the ways that they're going about that.
Bruce, there is a small paradox here, though, isn't there, where the pandemic has probably taught all of us about some of the inequity in our society and some of the needs that weren't necessarily all that evident have become so in all of this. And yet people are not yet at that stage of translating that into greater generosity. What do you think is still holding people back?
Well, I mean, the survey data that we've been looking at clearly says that the economic impact of the pandemic on many people's personal financial situation is that primary factor that's holding them back. But you raise a really interesting point. I'm a hopeful person. I work in the charitable sector, and I think those of us who work in that sector do so because we believe in building a better society. If I think of a silver lining in this pandemic cloud, what you just raised is in fact one of those silver linings. The fact that so many people have come into personal first contact with the charitable and nonprofit sector in a way that affects them personally, affects their family members, their work colleagues, their friends, I believe will have a lasting positive impact on society. So when their means are restored, I don't believe that people will just forget about that food bank that provided services or that mental health organization that helped them when they were struggling with isolation and lockdown.
Yeah.
And I think that will be transformative in the future.
Yeah, Kevin, what do you think? Is our complacency going to end, do you think?
Well, there's two things I think are important to keep in mind. One is that a lot of people are viewing not just charities as the way to have a positive social impact. They're concerned about what they eat, what they wear, where they shop. So we're seeing a real increase in social conscious purchasing. So I often talk to young people about their discretionary dollars, and they really view their spending power as they want to spend for good. And that sometimes it's a donation to a charity, sometimes it's a GoFundMe cause. They're largely agnostic about the vehicle as long as it's the cause that applies to them. And so that's a positive thing. It's a challenge for charities because they're not the only way, or maybe even the preferred way for people to get engaged. So that's something that, but as our society in general, that's a very positive and a very hopeful trend to build on, is that people are looking for multiple ways. And then within that, the conversations that we've been part of around addressing systemic racism, of addressing inequality, those seem to have gotten attention and some longevity. I believe that it's long overdue, but the conversations seem more meaningful and more durable, and people aren't going to, as Bruce said, when this is over, they're not going to forget. And organizations like ours really need to make sure that we make some changes that mean that we won't forget either, and that we'll have changed ourselves based on what we know today in ways that affects how we work tomorrow.
Bruce, I think you and Kevin have both mentioned the idea that there was initially a pretty solid tranche of funds that came toward charities, and then came some federal subsidies that were helpful to the sector and to your operations of charities. Tell me a little bit about what your expectations might be now in terms of the next 6 to 12 months as we get vaccines in this country, but as the economy hasn't quite regenerated by virtue of the missing dynamic of in-person events and workplaces. What kind of sustaining support might there need to be here for the next year from the federal government?
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's actually one of the big concerns we have. So, again, our data suggests that there's about 2.4 million Canadians who work for charities and nonprofits, and that the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy Program as a direct intervention has been incredibly helpful for our sector. Staff who were laid off were either recalled, or organizations were able to not have to lay off staff, amongst other measures. And it's interesting, as we look forward to 2021, we're worried about a gap between either an abrupt end to some of these measures that have really supported the sector, and a time when the economy is roaring, which would support our sector. Because there's a real link between the health and well-being of the Canadian economy and the health and well-being of charities. That gap is of grave concern because most charities entered the pandemic with little or no reserve. And they've spent through a lot of that. And so if the larger that gap, the more in jeopardy the services are. So we hope, and through conversations with the federal government, that they'll continue to understand the situation that we're in. And rather than think about an abrupt end, look at an off ramp so that we can harmonize the end of those supports with a ramp up of the Canadian economy.
Yeah, Kevin, February seems about 5,000 years ago, but my recollection was that we were worried about real economic slowdown, that we might be even entering a recession as a country eventually in all of this. It looks like the pandemic has taken something like a 7 or 8% hole out of the economy when you finally summarize it all. But that next year, we're expected to get some pretty good growth back. So show me what that bridge looks like here for the next year in terms of what kind of support is necessary in order to sustain the activities and leave people in a decent enough position to be able to capitalize when things do come back.
Yeah, so that's a really good insight, because what's been happening in a lot of charities is that as they've been surviving, they've been shedding staff, they've been losing access to facilities, they've been losing volunteers, and so there's a kind of a hollowing out of a lot of organizations. And so they're concerned, can they actually will they be able to rehire those staff, or have they gone off and found something else? And even if they, so there's concern about, can they actually find the people and attract them back to a sector when things start to improve. So that's an open question. But what is concrete and can happen is that donors to the sector, whether they're individuals or foundations like us, or governments who are in fact the largest funder of many organizations, can really change the way that they fund organizations and move away from projects more into core support to identify organizations that do good work and provide them the money and the flexibility to do what they need to do to rebuild and maintain their services. So a lot of the bridging between this period will be helped if funders are more flexible and move more towards trust-based funding of organizations that they know, and less around strict project funding that sometimes is useful work, but not exactly what the organization requires.
Yeah, I'm of a divided mind around technology sometimes. I like the idea of being able to order something online and get it to my place in a day or two. I get that. On the other hand, I worry about what it does to the local business, and then I'm also a little skittish at times about online donation. I realize it's convenient, but I also wonder whether it takes a little bit of the relationship out, and to some degree depersonalizes it a little bit. And yet the pandemic appears to have been good in the sense that technology has come along to permit people to donate online much more easily. How do we get the other part back?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting. I think into 2021, as we start to understand the data better, it will be interesting to examine the nature of the donations that have come in online. Are these individuals who used to go to special events recognize they couldn't go to an in-person event? So it's more on the small gift side versus the large gift side. And I'll be curious to see how this lands, because you can't beat in person. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. That relationship, the ability to have a back and forth conversation, explain the impact of the mission or cause, is just something that you can't replace. And yet they're actually quite wonderful for the sector to see folks who maybe weren't going to do that impulse donation at a coin box in a kettle at Christmas time, or taking a toy to a toy drive, who have gone online and now intentionally made a gift. I think, again, the upside there is that there's an opportunity to engage with those donors immediately in a pretty low cost way. And then as in person is restored, start to bring a hybrid together on how that's done.
Nice. I want to ask both of you in closing about when and how we'll get back to something that resembles business as usual, charities as usual, the giving sector as usual. Kevin, what does it take? Is it simply the vaccine, or more beyond that?
That's a great question. The challenges of forecasting at the end of the year. I think many charities have really found that the most important thing for them to do is identify their purpose and make sure that that's clear what their purpose is, and so that they'll attract support and supporters that align to that purpose. And and I think charities have found throughout this pandemic that if you're able to do that, you've honed your messaging and you've honed your capacity to find supporters. And I think the sector is well placed to do that. Their purpose, working for purpose in the sector, has never been more important and more visible than it is now. So I think it's for the sector to get back to, you're going to see, I think, an increased focus on purpose. And so if you think of the cancer charities as an example, and the health charities, who really took a significant loss of income because of the event-based approach. But when they've started to focus their messaging on the essential research that is no longer being funded because of the lack of donation revenue, people are coming back and saying, oh, that's actually the reason why I supported you in the first place. So they're getting past the message of the event as the fundraiser and back to the core purpose. And I think that's resonating with people in ways that is very authentic.
Nice. Bruce?
Well, one of the things that we're kind of keeping an eye on is and Kevin had alluded to it earlier, is this surge in demand for services. So early on in the pandemic, 35% of organizations across the country reported that they'd seen an increase in demand. That's risen to 46%. And so now almost half of charities are saying that more Canadians are coming to them needing service. So as we think about going into 2021, I think we need to look at both sides of the equation. Not just what does this mean for organizations as they seek to find whatever this new normal is, from an operation, a revenue generation standpoint, but what is also going to happen with demand? Mm-hmm. How long is it going to take post-vaccine for demand to return to potential, levels that were more predictable before the pandemic? Because I think that's one of the challenges for our sector. It's a double whammy. It's not just about worrisome or softness in a relationship to donations, particularly in the holiday period. It's about organizations also trying to fulfill increased demand for the people in their communities. I'm hopeful that the continued innovation of the sector will allow us to do that. But I think that this, as we go forward, this link to the economy is crucial, both for the demand and the supply side.
Does it worry you at all, though, Bruce, that in the pandemic, we now have a clearer picture of our country and its needs, and that essentially it is going to continue to be the job of the charities to take care of many of these new needs?
Yes and no, all at the same time. So I do worry about the health and well-being of the sector, but because more Canadians, those who are in small and medium-sized enterprise, big business, and those in government, now understand the importance of all three sectors working together so that we've got strong communities, that can only be good news for our society going forward.
Yeah, and Kevin, in as much as it was referred to as a silver lining, does at least the illumination of our condition give us at least a bit of a roadmap on where we have to go?
Yeah, and the thing I would note too is with the recent appointment of Nikki Sharma as Parliamentary Secretary for Community Development and Nonprofits, there's now a clear window and an avenue to talk to government about what the sector is learning, because we're seeing frontline agencies with deep knowledge of what's happening in their community and some really good ideas on how to address them. And so we're quite optimistic that we can take that knowledge that the sector has generated through its decades of experience and present that to a government that said they want to listen. So we're quite optimistic that we're certainly going to knock on the door and engage in a conversation every chance we get.
Well, I hope that everybody who stayed with us during our discussion will then immediately go online, find a place to support, and do it here before the end of the year. I want to thank both of you for your time today and for your generosity and commitment to the sector. Bruce McDonald is the President and CEO of Imagine Canada, and Kevin McCourt is President and CEO of the Vancouver Foundation. Stay well and safe, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
You've been watching BIB Today. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief. We'll see you again.